All right. Good morning. Welcome to. We have a few handouts on this front chair right here by Trenton. Not like we've actually used the handouts yet, but I know. You know how that goes. Our discussion is usually better than the questions on the handout, so I'm okay with that, right? It's good in this kind of a format to talk about what kind of interested you from the video, so we're good with that. There actually are a couple of questions on this week's study that we'll probably get to that deal with kind of church and state issues, and so maybe get to that a little bit. But the video today continues on, right? Continues on. If you missed the first 2 weeks, the first week was kind of the end of Luther's life and shortly after, and then last week was kind of from after Luther's life into the future. Today they continue on. So it's really kind of a progression of the Lutheran Church post-Luther, right? So it's still all considered Reformation time. I think we sometimes have this idea that the Reformation consists of Luther's life and then all of a sudden the Reformation's over. There's actually a lot that happens in kind of formulating the Lutheran Church past Luther's life. The Reformation really continues past that. So I think that's the real strength of this video, of this third video series, is that they kind of project the importance of the things after Luther's life, which is really, I mean, you've heard Luther's life and to varying degrees. You've seen Luther's movies to varying degrees. You've had Bible classes and stuff like that. But how many of you have ever talked about what happens after, right? Probably never. Perhaps you've read in a church history book, but even a Luther history book will not go past Luther's death, typically. So I think this is the real strength of this third part. There is some history to it, so there are things that you can go home and look up and say, oh, that's right. Today they talk about the 30 Years' War and the Peace of Westphalia, and it's like, oh, okay, I can Google search those or find them on Wikipedia to a certain extent or things like that. So you might do that. That's the other strength of this handout that you have, or that you maybe don't have. The handout actually has all kinds of other resources that you can look up. And so you can go, and there's all kinds of links. If you want this video, if you want this handout online, you just go to LHM/men.org. Lutheran Hour Ministry/men.org. Click on Bible Studies, and you can actually view all three parts. 2 years ago we did part 1, last year we did part 2, this year we're doing part 3. You can view all three parts. They're all on there for free. You can click on the videos and watch them streaming or download them to your computer. You can click on any of the handouts. The handouts all have live links. So if you open up the handout on your computer, you can just click on links and search for other stuff you want to take a look at. So that's the real strength of the handout. That's why we provided the handout more than going through all the questions in the handout. But it's a nice resource. You may also use the handout for just kind of further study from today. Reflect on some of the quotes. They have quotes and then some questions, and you might find it interesting, just yourself, personal study during the week, to take a look at those questions in the study, even if we don't get to them all, okay? So that's the handout. If we'll have a few more handouts since we have 2 more weeks. I'll print a few more handouts next week, and so we'll have some more, because I think we're finally out of them here on week 3. With that, any other words? Excellent. That's you have pastor talking and then pretty face, right? So we make a great team.
Hey, I'm over here.
I'm sorry. To the preschoolers, you're known as the old pastor. So sorry. We got the old pastor, the talking pastor, and the pretty face. So all 3 of us make a really good team. Let's roll the video, Jude, and dim the lights. Hit 5 on the lights for me.
If anyone saith that man is truly absolved from his sins and justified, and that by this faith alone absolution and justification are effected, let him be anathema. The Council of Trent.
So what we have to think about at the end of the 16th century is that the religious landscape was shifting, and you have a re-energized Catholicism, a militant church. But the most dynamic Protestant group at the end of the 16th century were the Calvinists. Some of the territories that had converted to Protestantism had been reclaimed by Catholicism, and some areas had converted to Calvinism. The Calvinists weren't covered by the Peace of Augsburg, so technically speaking, they weren't legal. So this is going to create a lot of tensions.
One place where tension was high was the Kingdom of Bohemia. Most of the Bohemians, including the noble class, were Protestant. Matthias, the son of the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian, was positioning himself to be the next king of Bohemia. And from there, he would later become the Holy Roman Emperor.
So when Matthias became king of Bohemia, he had to be elected by the nobles. And most of the nobles in Bohemia were Protestant. And they demanded certain concessions from Matthias before they were willing to give him the throne. And this included something known as the Letter of Majesty. The Letter of Majesty is significant because in this case it allowed religious freedom on the individual level. The previous agreements within the empire had been at the princely level. It was, whatever the religion of the prince is, that's your religion. In this case now, it's allowing essentially freedom of conscience.
As from today, no person, neither of the higher free estates, nor the inhabitants of unfree towns and villages, nor the peasants, shall be forced or compelled by any device by the authorities over them, or by any person, spiritual or temporal, to forsake his religion and accept another religion. The Letter of Majesty.
So, the idea of individual rights and freedom of conscience, and I get to make my own choice, this is just unheard of.
This made the Bohemian Protestants thrilled. However, Matthias's other relative, Ferdinand II, a die-hard Jesuit-trained Catholic, was not thrilled with this idea.
Matthias is part of the Catholic Habsburg dynasty. They had rulers all over Europe. They were all related by marriage, but they didn't always get along.
Ferdinand II, as Archduke of the Tyrol, had managed to extirpate Protestantism in his region. He brought in Jesuit scholars, closed down Protestant schools and churches, and cast out all the teachers and pastors, and had managed within a few years to turn the Tyrol from a Protestant Catholic kind of mix into a die-hard fanatically Catholic county.
When Ferdinand II was elected to be the next king of Bohemia, he promised to honor the Letter of Majesty. The problem was that no one really thought that he was going to actually keep that promise. The Protestants who knew of Ferdinand's reputation were really upset. A meeting was called in Prague Castle to address their grievances.
Now, the meeting got a little heated because the Protestants were definitely afraid that their religious freedom was on the line. The Catholic representatives of Matthias, some of them were a little more amenable than others, and they were allowed to leave the room. However, 2 others and their secretary remained. These guys were the hardline anti-Protestant Catholics. These gentlemen thought that they were going to arrest them and they could become martyrs, being wrongfully imprisoned by these gentlemen. What they did not expect was that the Protestants then grabbed them and threw them out the window. This is known as the defenestration of Prague.
So defenestration is just a long word. It simply means out the window. And actually, this is not the first defenestration of Prague. This has happened before in Prague, because apparently that's what angry Czechs do.
The previous defenestration of Prague that marked the Hussite Wars, the men that they threw out died. So they threw these men out two of them and their secretary, and amazingly, all three of the men survived.
I've actually been to Prague. I've looked at the window. I've looked at it from the outside and the inside, and I can tell you it's a long drop.
Now, of course, this episode began to gather stories because these men managed to walk from such a terrible drop.
The Catholics said that they were saved or caught by angels of the divine hand.
The Protestants said, well, they landed on a pile of manure. Either way, this episode began the 30 Years' War.
As Ferdinand II is dealing with this issue, he is elected as the new emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. He immediately prepares for war.
The war was an unmitigated disaster. It wiped out possibly up to a third of Germany's population. The human misery and the cost was terrible. So the armies oftentimes went unfunded, and the states did not have the capital to raise these forces. And so how these armies sustained themselves was by going into a territory. They occupied the territory. Cavalry served the purpose of spreading out, fanning over this territory, and collecting the contribution tax, usually in the form of food and supplies, and then bringing it back into the army. Naturally, peasants were devastated by this because they were not compensated for their material. It was justified as a tax, and they lost it. And the war moved around Germany based upon where armies had already been. If armies had been in the territory too long, it was unsustainable to stay there because all the food had been taken away. The troops would starve. For example, in the 1620s, a historian noted that when the Swedish army was in Estonia, the year before the Swedish army was there was close to, say, a couple thousand cattle, tens of thousands of chickens, and then on the tax registers, the next year after the Swedish army had left, there were no cattle and 3 chickens left in the province. This is why peasants starved, and what this created was artificial famine within Germany. The war, being so long and complicated, historians generally have divided up into 4 phases, first being the Bohemian phase, then the Danish phase, then the Swedish phase, then the French phase. The Bohemian phase, the Bohemians lost miserably. You even had Lutherans fighting on the side of the emperor. This terrified the nearby King of Denmark, who decided to intervene in the war and suddenly bringing an international element into this. The King of Denmark, however, was not ready to face off against the combined power of most of the German princes behind the emperor, and his territories were overrun and he lost. Then, using this as an excuse, Ferdinand continued to roll back Protestant privileges within the empire and assert more absolute power. This alarmed the King of Sweden, Gustavus Adolphus, and he intervened, beginning the Swedish phase. Now, Gustavus Adolphus's army was the most modern army at the time. It was the most advanced militarily in terms of its techniques and technologies used. Historians today oftentimes refer to him as the father of modern warfare. His Swedish army was trained and experienced after fighting in Poland over most of the 1620s, and when they showed up in Germany, they won in battle after battle after battle. Within 2 years, he had conquered Prague, and he was at the gates of Vienna. Now, at this point, things went wrong for the Protestants. Gustavus died in battle. The story goes, his officers told him before a cavalry charge to put his armor on. He looked at them, and he said, "The Lord God is my armor," and he charged off into battle. 30 minutes later, his horse came back without its rider. Gustavus had died, and the Protestant war effort, at that point, had lost its leader. The Catholics began to roll back the Protestant tide. This alarmed another power, and this was specifically France. Now, at this time, French foreign policy was not actually run by King Louis XIII. It was actually run by his chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, as in a cardinal, a prince of the church, a man who elects the Pope, a very, very Catholic individual. However, Richelieu had been actively, secretly aiding Protestant enemies of the Catholic Habsburgs wherever he could. He had been paying subsidies to the Swedes. He had also been paying subsidies to the Dutch in their wars against the Spanish. So in 1635, Richelieu declared war on the Spanish and then in turn declared war on their cousins, the Austrian Habsburgs, and this began the French phase of the war. Now there were the Lutheran princes on the side of the French and the Swedes, and some Lutherans even joined up on the side of the Emperor, each one taking sides, trying to sort out the whole mess. The Swedes actually managed to take Prague by 1645, which, oddly enough, was the very place where the whole thing started. In 1648, the war, thankfully, was finally brought to a close in Germany with the Peace of Westphalia. The Peace of Westphalia was designed to be amenable to all parties to the treaty. However, it was not necessarily amenable to those outside of the war, and all parties agreed to ignore these sides, which included the papacy, which was furious with the fact that Protestantism had not been extirpated or rolled back at the end of the treaty. The Pope declared it null, void, invalid, iniquitous, unjust, damnable, reprobate, inane, and meaningless. European leaders, both Catholic and Protestant, ignored his opinion.
The 30 Years' War didn't end all of the fighting over Protestantism in Europe, but it did bring about the idea of a sovereign state where the rulers of the state, not the Pope, would be in charge. And the idea of freedom of conscience and individual rights would gain importance.
So Henry sent a request to the Pope in Rome asking for a dispensation of the marriage that would grant him an annulment. The only problem was
Henry's timing was horrible. Charles V was sacking Rome, and Charles V was the nephew of Catherine of Aragon.
All right, so these events now, Luther died 1546. So the 30 Years' War starts about 70 years after Luther's death and ends just right at 102 years following Luther's death. So we are now 100 years out from the end of Luther's life, just in terms of like thinking that through where we're at in terms of history. So, thoughts from the video? Anything stick out, jump out at you? Say that again. Well, that was, yeah, that's really the thing during the 30 Years' War, and they picked that up just right at the end. The one speaker mentioned that there were Lutherans kind of fighting on all sides because it was such a mess. It was such a mess. Right, by this time, Sweden is all Lutheran, right? I mean, they're probably 98% plus Lutheran. And so when they talk about Protestant Sweden, I mean, that's Lutheran Sweden to a great extent. And then you have Calvinists in the mix. And then you have Lutherans fighting on the Emperor Roman Catholic side. You have Lutherans fighting on the Swedish side. You have Lutheran. I mean, it's a mess. The 30 Years' War was just terrible. I mean, and then you have, who's the second country that got into it just because he was worried? Denmark. Denmark gets into it just because he's worried about what's going on. So it's like, okay, well, knee-jerk reaction, let's attack. Well, right? It's like best defense is offense, right? And that was really, I mean, that's what the 30 Years' War was about. Best defense is a good offense. And so it was very much a war that was fought to preserve what different groups held important. And it just became a mess as others got into it. And in the midst of it were all kinds of people, right? I mean, can you imagine? Germany, they said a third of population. A third of the population died. This is the 30 Years' War. One of the really cool stories during the 30 Years' War is about a Lutheran pastor, Martin Rinkhart. Martin Rinkhart is known for writing "Now Thank We All Our God." Now thank we all our God with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things have done, in whom this world rejoices, who from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way, with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. He wrote that. I forget what town he was in. He was pastor in a town. He was the only pastor for a time. The town had been sacked 3 times by different armies. The people in the countryside, you always go to a walled city for protection, so the population swelled. There was starvation and famine and disease. He buried over 4,400 people in the course of just a couple of years. Himself, he was the only pastor in town, including his wife. And during that time, he writes to him, "Now thank we all our God." It's like the coolest story. It's like Paul in our epistle lesson today, right? I've learned to be content in any and every circumstance, right? And so Pastor Martin Rinkhart, it's kind of one of the cool stories, if you can have a cool story coming out of the 30 Years' War. It's one of the cool stories coming out of the 30 Years' War. This pastor who writes such an incredible hymn of faith in the midst of such misery and death and destruction and just terrible, terrible circumstances. Anything else jump out at you that you wanted to know about or hear about?
Just these men of faith or whatever were so quick to go into war and kill people.
Yeah, fascinating, right? Men of faith so quick to go to war and kill others. Yeah, I would like to, I don't know if I'd like to, I would point out that religious wars are very often not completely about religion, right? Religious wars are very often not completely about religion. I'm not sure that there should be such a thing as a religious war as Christians, right? I mean, as Christians. Others, I guess I understand war from other religions, but for Christians really shouldn't wage a religious war. That's really it's really an oxymoron.
Yeah, no, I think it's absolutely right. The political climate at the time was just a complete mess. I mean, you have so many different little princedoms. We talked about a couple weeks ago that all of Germany was fractured and they were all trying to vie for land and for property, for authority. And a lot of the Protestants that supported Luther because it was a nice way to advance their own political position. So they used religion as an excuse for a lot of the stuff that went on. But I mean, that's not the case in every situation. And a lot of people forget the 30 Years' War, there was not a war like it until the World War I. I mean, it was just devastating. It just took Germany and turned it upside down. And the result of this was the Peace of Westphalia in 1648. And that, they didn't really talk about it a whole lot, but that is incredibly significant. Not just for the Lutheran Church, not just for the Reformed Church and the Catholic Church, but for human reason, knowledge, science, culture. The Renaissance was born out of the 30 Years' War. This desire to learn, to seek knowledge and reason, this desire to move away from the church was born out of the 30 Years' War. All the great philosophers that we think about, Kant, Rousseau, Leibniz, Nietzsche, they all saw what religion did to Germany in the 30 Years' War. Like, that's ridiculous. So we're going to take religion out of the realm of politics, out of the realm of thinking, out of the realm of rationality, and we're going to associate it with feelings. And then we're going to separate that completely from how we live our daily lives in society. It was a very, we kind of term, anthropocentric move. The Reformation kind of turned everyone in on themselves, their own spiritual experience, their own, where do you fall on the Reformation thing? Are you Catholic, Lutheran, Reformed? I don't know, it's all about what you think. It's not about what the church, the Roman Catholic Church says is true. It's about what I think is true. So it turns religion kind of in on itself. It's kind of a, I don't know, good or bad. You can discuss that. But consequence of the Reformation in that sense. Yeah, question?
Well, two things. Number one, I think the Renaissance began in the 1300s.
Renaissance, I misspoke. Enlightenment. Enlightenment, yeah. Thank you very much. That was embarrassing. Yeah, Renaissance, Enlightenment. Two different things. Renaissance is good art, Enlightenment is, bad thing. Yeah.
It's always one of those, know your history when you have a history teacher in the room.
And then the second thing was that it kind of brushed over this, but it was John Calvin and the Swiss Confederation and how they diffused in France and went all the way up into Scotland. And what was the main reason why the other Protestants kind of would not recognize Calvinism?
Well, and I'm not sure that it was so much the other, and when you're talking, at this time when you're talking other Protestants, you're talking some Zwinglians, but mostly Lutherans. So other Protestants would be Lutherans. Why didn't the Lutherans recognize the Calvinists? And I think honestly it's probably historically linked to Calvin not listening to Luther and Calvin not getting together on the sacraments, and so the Lutherans really did not want to collaborate isn't the right word, but the Lutherans didn't want to just kind of mesh with the Calvinists and become kind of less than what they were. Calvinists didn't want to do it either. So they kind of ignored each other. What's interesting, and they barely touched on this, but the Roman Catholic Church, although they recognized Lutheranism, they did not recognize Calvin and Zwingli as legal religions. And so where Lutheranism was really a legal religion, and we talked about that last week, that as the prince believes, so believe the people. So the prince gets to dictate whether your province is Lutheran or Roman Catholic. Calvinism wasn't, you couldn't pick if your province was going to be Calvin. And so I think part of that migration of Calvinism, it was they went where they could be welcomed, because a lot of Germany was not open to Calvinism, both Lutheran and Roman Catholic. They didn't want Calvinism because Calvinism was wrong. And while Roman Catholics would still say Lutherans were wrong, they at least tolerated and had made it legal to be Lutheran. Does that answer?
Yeah.
I think that's what's going on.
Specifically, what did they not like about Calvinism?
It goes back to small collecting, right?
Bad theology.
Sacraments is the big thing. Calvin said it's just a symbol, there's just a spiritual reality, there's not really physical presence in the body and blood. And Luther, that was his decision. I mean, he was talking with Calvin about this, and Luther had the opportunity to unite the entire Reformation, to really stick it to the Pope. And this was the one thing that he got hung up on, that he would not pull the trigger and join Calvin simply because Calvin didn't think that body and blood was present in the bread and wine.
And there's also there's really a religious philosophical difference between Luther and Calvin also. Luther did not want to start a new church. Luther wanted the Roman Catholic Church to be the church and fix the things that were wrong. And Luther had a very big, that was really, Luther cleaned up the worship service. Luther cleaned up the Mass. Luther wanted to clean up a lot of, he cleaned up saints. Luther cleaned up a lot of things during his time. But he did not want to be a Lutheran church. He wanted to be the Roman Catholic Church correct. Calvin wanted to throw away everything that was Roman Catholic. Dismiss it. Throw it all away, because we will not be Roman Catholic. And that's a significant That's a significant philosophical difference between Luther and Calvin at that time. I think Zwingli a little less so. Zwingli and Luther were pretty close coming to agreement, but Calvin was just sort of throw off everything that's Roman Catholic. And then Calvin had this view that Jesus is located in heaven at the right hand of the throne of God, and because he is located at the right hand of the throne of God, he cannot be present in word, in water, in bread and wine. He can't be present. He's present in heaven and not present in these things with gifts for you. And so the sacraments and the word become symbolic gestures that we do, and I would guess, and I've never really read this in Luther, but really kind of the Lutheran objection to Calvinism is it diminishes God. And so churches that are non-sacramental, and again, right, Bible class, so we can talk about this. I'm not defaming your friends or saying they're going to hell at all. But the objection, I think, that Lutherans still have today about other Protestant denominations is that they minimize God. They minimize God's power. They minimize God's presence. They minimize God's authority. They minimize God. And the Lutherans during Luther's time and after Luther's time didn't want to compromise minimizing God. And honestly, I think for all the foibles that Roman Catholics have, well, they hold God in high regard also. I mean, they still sacramental. God is present. God is powerful. God has authority. Pope has a lot of authority too, so they share that. And I think I can't help but think, and I don't know that for sure, Joe, but I can't help but think that's got to be part of it. That's got to be part of it is that you do not hold God in high regard anymore. You've minimized him in so many ways that will minimize you. I don't know that for sure. My father-in-law, who's way wiser than me, is here. I mean, do you have a comment on that? I always like putting him on a spot because he hates it. He hates it. So I sort of apologize, but don't.
Yeah, you did that the last time I came.
I know. I think I did it one time when you weren't really listening to me. I get that a lot in my family. But I did that one time and he wasn't really listening, and it was like, I saw it in his eyes, kind of that oh crap moment, that it was like, I don't know what you were saying.
Well, let me give an analogy or something. We were just in Zurich this summer, and so we're taking the tour, and there is this, there is this statue. Wow, I didn't mean to have to undress. There was this statue of Ulrich Zwingli in full military, and the guide, really a great Swiss guide actually, was telling the story. Well, gee, it's a shame that they came so far almost to agreement except on this one matter, is what he was saying. And then I said to him, didn't Luther say to Zwingli, Sie haben einen anderen Geist, you have a different spirit. And in that, he was referring to the fact that is means is in terms of hocus mea corpus. And then also, and of course this is more Pieper, but he said to Zwingli, Jugulum petisti, you have me by the throat, because it does matter. And so there's two things from this analogy. First of all, the importance of what we believe sacramentally, as you've been saying. But the other is Zwingli in military dress, and he actually got killed not too much later. The thing is, church and state were really mingled so strongly that it's my way or we're going to fight you. And I don't think, certainly that was not the spirit of Luther, but I think in a sense that is part of the difference. And that's all I have to say.
Other questions or comments, thoughts?
In the 30-Year War, both sides have claimed God was on their side. If you go back...
All four sides.
All four.
Or more, but yeah.
So you go back to the Old
So all the sides would say God is on our side. Go ahead.
So really, where do you go with that? The Old Testament was very clear, God is on their side. They won. If they weren't right with God, they did not.
All right. No, that's actually, Dave, a great question. So Dave's question was, you pick up on this kind of religious war, quote unquote, which I really despise calling it a religious war, but in their minds it kind of was, right? I mean, very much so. And so it's this God is on our side thing. It's, we have the same thing happens with sports teams that pray before they go out to play, and God give us victory, right? No. That's not what a sports team should ever pray. The sports team should maybe pray, keep us safe from harm while we play, help us be good sports, things like that. But there are coaches who, give us victory kind of a thing. The same kind of thing, right? The Old Testament, completely different than the New Testament. Completely different. In the Old Testament, the Israelites were ruled by a theocracy. God is king. In fact, so much so that when Israel said, give us a king like the nations, God said, no. You don't want a king like the nations because I'm your God. And they said, oh, but give us a king like the nations. And God was like, no, you don't want a king like the nations. It won't go well for you. He'll take your children to war, and he'll hoard all the best for himself, and he'll take the best of your fields, and he'll take your daughters for work in his palace. And right, you do not want a king like the nations, because the nations' kings are bad news. You don't want a king like nations. And Israel said, oh, give us a king like the nations. We're not satisfied with God being king because, we don't see him on a daily basis, or I don't know, something like that. And so God said, fine, pinheads. You want a king like the nations, I'll give you a king like the nations. And they got Saul. And Saul was just like a king of the nations. Seems to have started out well, but he took sons for war and daughters for palace, and a substantial amount of crops and livestock, and ruled over the people like the nations. See, you don't want a king like the nations because I'm your king. And then God installs David and says, okay, so this is a king after my own heart. And that's the kind of king you need. You need a king who's going to reflect me, right? And so as David is king, God is the king behind, right? So David is God's servant, and so we still have a theocracy because God is king. When we get to the New Testament, that kingship is sucked up into Christ, right? Jesus is prophet, priest, and king. The offices that God gave to his Old Testament people to serve them through those offices get subsumed into Jesus, so that Jesus becomes the archetype prophet, priest, and king. And Israel, God's people, the new Israel, no longer needs prophet, priest, king in the way they had them in the Old Testament. No longer a theocracy. Now Romans 12 says we live under the governing authorities of the world that are, not 12, 13, that are installed by God and are still servants of God, but things are different. So when you get to Christian wars, right, religious wars, they have no place. Right? Really, a religious war has no place. None at all. Because God doesn't dictate and say, okay, Lutherans, invade and win. We don't have that mandate anymore. The mandate is invade and proclaim the gospel. Right? Having gone, Matthew 28, not go, therefore, and make disciples. It's having gone, being out in the world already. You've already invaded into the world, make disciples. That's the command. It's not invade and slaughter, but it's invade and witness. Invade and baptize, invade and teach. Right? So it's completely different. So a religious war, a Christian war, I should say Christian. A Christian war has no basis, right? Constantine, there's historical question about Constantine. I think there's lots of historical questions about Constantine and whether he was really a Christian. He probably died. I think he died as a Christian. Right, conversion by the sword isn't what Christians are about. And there were all kinds of times throughout history where Christians did things the wrong way. The Crusades are a great example too, right? Convert by the sword, that's not what we're called to do. Convert by the gospel is what we're called to do. And so Christian wars are I think, an abhorrence to God. Now, can Christians fight just wars when called to by government? Yes. Romans 13. The government bears the sword in God's place. And when those wars are just, it is okay for Christians to fight them. Although a lot of Christians feel a lot of guilt after fighting a war, right? And because killing people is still killing people, right? And there's a Fifth Commandment issue, even if you're fighting a just war, right? It often weighs on Christians. I've had many members who've been in World War II or other war vets who just don't even like to talk about the war because of the pain that it brings in memory of taking life. But so Christian wars, no, right? That's an abhorrence to God. And I think the 30 Years' War is a great example that God was not pleased with the 30 Years' War. I just can't even imagine. God was in just probably abject horror over it.
It raises an interesting question, though, because what if Luther had gone and sided with Calvin? What if the radical reformers were able to unite with the Lutherans and they could provide a unified front? Perhaps this internecine, just devastating war could have been avoided if Luther had just said, you know what, the sacraments, they're quite great and everything, I love them, but for the sake of peace, harmony, and unity, I'll agree with you guys, and we'll just kind of downplay that doctrine, that teaching of the church. What if he had done that? You know, how many lives possibly could have been saved? But at what cost? It's a matter of truth. So my question, should you picture our church doing that today? What would we be able to sacrifice, willing to sacrifice, for what's true? I don't think we ask ourselves that very much these days. It's just an interesting question, because we can kind of look back at Luther and be like, he should have just forgotten and just, sided with Zwingli and Calvin and followed Melanchthon's guide and kind of just fuzzed the edges a little bit of Lutheran doctrine, just for the sake of peace. But Luther was adamant. Truth is truth, and it's not my truth. It's not Lutheran truth. It's God's truth. And that can't be compromised.
And that's really the thing. I think sometimes, I've been foolishly, that's a bad word. Although I think it's silly, but I've been accused of proclaiming that other Christians are going to hell. Why? Because truth matters, right? And my people know that truth matters to me. I don't believe other Christians are going to hell. I think people who call themselves Christians, whether they're Lutheran or who, may not be saved, but it's not because of what they teach. But I'm Lutheran because I think the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has the best game theologically in the world. And truth matters. God's word tells us that truth matters. And so I'm a member of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, not because I think I'm better than everybody else, but because I think we're going to be in heaven and everybody else is going to be in heaven, but because truth matters. And that's why we don't compromise. We don't compromise on teachings when it's a matter of truth. And so Luther did not compromise with Calvin or Zwingli. He tried hard. I mean, he met face to face with Zwingli, and I mean, he wrote letters upon letters to these guys, and he tried hard, but he was not willing to compromise. I think that's what God's Word calls us to do. We should not be willing to compromise the truth of God's Word. It's important. We hold to that truth above all else. I said it in the new member thing today, right? Even be willing to die before forsaking the truth. Be willing to die before forsaking the truth of God's Word. Interesting phenomenon today. We have all kinds of people who church hop, don't we? It's kind of an interesting thing. I'm always curious why people are so easily church hop. And I don't know, maybe you hold that this church has the truth and then you become Lutheran, or you hold that Lutheran has the truth and then you become this denomination. I always scratch my head about that. It's a fascinating thing, I think, that we're willing to give up the truth. And you know, 30 Years' War, bad, terrible, ungodly. But you know what those people weren't willing to do? Compromise on the truth. When they actually fought for religious reasons, they weren't willing to compromise on the truth, which is an interesting thing. But in our postmodern world, when we're taught all the time, and blitzes at us all the time that truth is relative, it doesn't really matter where I belong as a Christian, just that I'm a Christian. Well, see, I think God's Word would say it does matter where you belong as a Christian, because God's truth is important. God's truth is important, and we should stand securely on it. I don't know. Think about that. Think about that when you're kids. Think about that, high schoolers, when you marry a nice Baptist boy or girl. What you're going to do in terms of faith? Are you really going to everything you've learned give that up? It's an interesting question to pose. Yeah, but he became Lutheran, so I would say that he made the right choice. Phil.
Reading and things you don't put it into perspective that, you know, the size, the land, the amount of territory, countries involved. And although you hear 30 years, to think 30 years, how can we maintain faith during those trials and tribulations? That's tough.
I know. Yeah, how do you maintain, how did the people like a Pastor Rinkhart maintain faith during that time when he was burying thousands of people? Maybe. I don't know. Yeah, that's a crazy thing. Although, Phil, I mean, now that I'm thinking about that, I think a lot of times, devastation actually brings us closer to engaging with the Lord. I actually talked about this with our synodical president. My coworkers made fun of me for hobnobbing with our synodical president, but I caught him in the elevator at our district meeting here last week, and we were talking, and he had mentioned in his thing that the kind of, you know, Christian churches in America are kind of on a downhill slide, and there's some research that says that LCMS will hopefully bottom out within the next 10 or 15 years. Right? And so we were talking about, didn't you say that it's also we're kind of due for a calamity? 10 or 15 years for a calamity. And but it's kind of interesting, when did the Lutheran Church grow the most? Following World War I? following World War II. So the most growth in the Lutheran Church, because calamity has a way of doing that, driving people to truth and to God's truth. I mean, so I don't know, 30 years war, I'll bet you there were Christians that came out of that pretty much stronger in the faith following it. Some didn't. I mean, some people despair of disaster and lose faith, but many have driven to deeper faith, to be sure, I think.
And I'm not entirely sure when I say this, but I did read that Sweden is now the least religious Europe.
It's still 98% Lutheran. But, still 98% Lutheran, but less than 1% actually attend on any given Sunday morning. Yeah, right. Sad. That's sad. Sad. Oh.
I just wanted to touch. You know, in some of my discussions with non-Christians, one of the things that come up, and you guys have touched on this, well, religion just causes wars, right? But you guys hit the nail on the head, because I really believe that it's greed, it's power, it's control, and it's veiled in religion.
I think
but it's still the sinful man that wants more power, more control, and those kind of things.
That's a great point, right? So when
I express that, and
I think you can look to history to prove that point too. Because, I mean, you look at somebody like Napoleon, not a religious guy, but he created a heck of a lot of chaos during the Napoleonic Wars, right? Hitler, yeah, not a Christian guy, created a lot of chaos during World War II, right? And so there are proofs that unbelievers are just as sinful as people who claim to be Christian can be. That's exactly right. Sinful man creates war, not religion. Sinful man creates war, not religion. Great point.
Yeah, I remember when I was talking, Jesus' words in Matthew 10. Do not think that I have come to bring peace to the earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. I have come to set man against his father, daughter against her mother, daughter-in-law against her mother-in-law, etc., etc. And you mentioned something like this in the other Gospels as well. I think Jesus kind of knows truth, God's good gift of grace, is completely antithetical to sin. It's completely against our human nature. And bring grace, bring God himself down into our midst, and we'll find a way to kill him. Because that's just what people do. And so I think we need to grieve wars. We need to mourn them. We need to work against them. I don't think we should be surprised. Because truth has a way, it's offensive. It's telling me I'm nothing before God. It's telling me that I am sinful, I'm insignificant. And quite frankly, people don't want to hear that. And they're willing to go to war for it. So, just
last comment, last thought, last question. All right, let's close with prayer. Gracious Heavenly Father, we rejoice and give you thanks for your truth that is made known to us in your word made flesh, through Jesus Christ, and the words that he spoke, and words that you have given to us in Holy Scriptures. We give you thanks for that word of truth, and we ask that you would help us to cling to your truth, the truth of the gospel, each and every day, and that you would help us, inspire us, that as we have gone out in the world, as we are part of the world around us, living in it but not of it, that you would help us to faithfully proclaim your word of life to those who still live in the darkness of sin and death. We ask that you would bless our week, that you would give us many opportunities to engage with people who have no hope, people who are lost in the midst of this sinful world, people who have no joy or contentment, people who just don't know you as they should. And we ask that you would open up those doors of opportunity to us, and then give us the words to speak. Make us bold proclaimers so that others might hear about the salvation that we have in Jesus Christ. Christ and Him crucified. Bless our days and grant us your peace and your presence with us until you draw us back again to your house for worship in your Son's name and for the receiving of your gifts again. It's in Jesus' name that we pray all these things. Amen. All right, go in peace.